Welcome to episode 74 of the Half Point Per Podcast. I'm your host, Evan Riggs. So glad to be back this week. Major shout out to Eli for hopping in and mock drafting with you guys last week. Joined, as always, by my co-host, Dalton Willie, and my producer, Johnny Pham. Guys, how you doing tonight?
Oh, buddy, I am going through it. We are during the middle of Beat Street season, and I've started a new job this week, so I can't just grind the beats.
Wow.
I missed the joy of this morning of Rojo as a potential cut earlier this week. I missed some more joy of Fat Lenny. It's been horrible that I can't.
I think there's
overreact
plenty
to
of Lenny to
everything.
go around. I think there's still some there if you want in on that.
I don't know. Word on the street is he's actually been working out really hard. Jim Jimerson, NFL, reported that. So,
Johnny, how are you tonight with your Coke Zero and Goldfish over there?
Okay, yeah, let's just out me with my snacks right now. It's
Hey
going
man,
good.
when you start pouring like a 4-gallon thin of Goldfish directly into your mouth, I've got to
it's
make
not
mention.
4 gallons, it's 30 ounces or 1.8 pounds, but it's going good. We are so close to being done with landscaping. I think this is the last weekend, and then we should be free. I hope.
Well, in case anyone was curious, I was in fact at Disney last week and Universal. Got this extremely sick lightsaber.
oh,
I don't know if you can like hear the sound of it.
No, we heard you turn it on.
Anyone on YouTube getting a nice little treat, very, very authentic Luke Skywalker lightsaber. Will not divulge how much I paid for it. That's you know what? Podcast is doing well. That's all I can say.
And now we're gonna have to slap a seizure warning on this video. So thanks for that one.
Hey, I will say that is pretty realistic. Like if you look up the Luke Skywalker sound, it's the exact same.
How heavy is it?
It's like it's a metal
5 pounds, like
not 5 pounds. It's not 5 pounds, but you could it doesn't feel like plastic. It's definitely metal. It's funny. It comes with like the blade is removable and you have to pay extra for that, by the way. So if you ever want to get one of those, little hot tip. But it comes with like a thing that you can take off the edge of the handle and put on like a longer one, so it looks better like on display. So I mean, it's pretty legit. But like I said, not divulging the cost of said lightsaber.
Yeah.
All right, guys, let's jump right in to our AFC previews. We can start what I say. AFC East. You know what? We'll start with a pretty easy team. Probably one of the top 3 offenses in the NFL. And if you guys haven't been reading my team previews, they will be out. If you're listening to this on the podcast version, it's already out. If you're joining us on YouTube at any point tonight, it'll be out tomorrow on Friday. Dalton, what is your storyline that you're looking at for the Buffalo Bills this season?
Oh, I thought you were going to say the Jets. Sorry, I just heard top 3 offense.
Unfortunately, it seems like the theme of this fantasy season is me going back in time and just hating on my old takes, because the question I'm asking myself is, will Josh Allen be the QB1 again? And I think that the odds are no longer in his favor.
Really? You don't think so?
Well, more importantly, I think that there's so much being baked into so many players' ADPs that Josh Allen repeats 2 performances he's had 2 years in a row, that you're losing a lot of value by the draft position of some of these players.
Do you have the stat on Josh Allen? I don't want to steal your thunder if you do. On the last guy that was back-to-back QB1 seasons before Josh Allen just did it?
No, I don't. So
Dante Culpepper, 2003, 2004, the last time someone went back-to-back. So I highly doubt he went 3 times, but yeah, I don't know.
Well, and that's part of my concern. You have 4 players going in the top 100 right now, 2 of them in the top 24 of their position. So you have Diggs in the top 12 overall. You have Gabriel Davis going as a top 24 wide receiver, and in competitive leagues, he's going at the 3-4 turn, which is probably his ceiling. You have Dawson Knox as the tight end 5. You have James Cook, who is a scat back in an offense that's never thrown to the running back, going in the top 100. It's a lot of pressure.
And did you say Devin Singletary in there?
Well, actually, Devin Singletary is going lower than.
Is he really? Yeah. Man, we're our ADPs that we're looking, because I'm just using Fantasy Pros for our previews, just because that's kind of less of the sharps, more of like average people. And I think I don't have it off the top of my head, but I think Singletary is higher than Cook in that one.
Well, then even then, he'd be going the top 100. So we're
Yeah.
at 6 players, and that's just asking a lot of an offense. That, and I spoke about this on our top 12 release, which everybody should listen to that when it drops on the YouTube.
Mhm.
Josh Allen did not just have like a full-fledged QB1 season. He had like a 7-point game. The Jags game was abysmal. The Falcons game, it took an entire game for him to get to almost 20 points. The Steelers game to start the season, there were questions about whether or not Josh Allen was even going to repeat last year. And a lot of those issues came from the offensive line. And I know everybody thinks the Bills had luxury picks in this draft. They didn't. The right side of their line is still pretty bad. Pro Football Focus has them as a top 14 line, but they have some older guys there. And so I'm going to be watching that. I think that we're getting really, really rich on all of the players in this Bills offense, and no one's talking about what the potential departure of Brian Daboll could mean, especially for Josh Allen's development. That's been huge. McDermott has consistently been a defensive coach. So I just think the majority of the Buffalo Bills, probably excluding Diggs, in my opinion, are just way too overpriced at this point for me to want to take any of them in fantasy.
This is shocking. I have Josh Allen as a love in my team preview that comes out tomorrow. I will say I did give the caveat in there, and I'll give it here too. I don't love where he's at, like on the overall board. I would not take a quarterback in the second round, maybe in the third round. But if you're talking just among quarterbacks, I think the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks are pretty interchangeable for me, with Mahomes, Allen, and Lamar Jackson would be my third. And I'm totally fine with Allen as the top guy. So that's why he's a love for me. But no, I'm looking at over here now. Devin Singletary is 74 overall on the RB29 on Fantasy Pro. So he's significantly higher on there. Gabe Davis, interestingly, a little bit lower on here, wide receiver 30. And that's what I'm going to be curious about these next couple of weeks and then into the season. First, these next few weeks, how high can Gabriel Davis actually get on draft boards before we start drafting? Because if he does actually go wide receiver 30, he will have been the most talked about wide receiver 30 of all time before drafts. Like every day you get on Twitter, it's something new with Gabe Davis, it feels like. I highly doubt that's going to stay. If he does stay down there, I am totally fine with that. I have him in the lukewarm category. Like don't love it, but I think that's about right on his value. And then during the season, there's just a lot of unknown with Davis on like how good this guy actually is. He had a great playoff game last year, no doubt about it. You can't, even though there were definitely some defensive lapses that helped, you don't put up 200 yards in a playoff game unless you're like at least a good NFL receiver, like pretty good. But he's never had more than 65 receptions in a season, never had more than 600 yards. And, I understand that we have to forecast the future a lot when it comes to this kind of stuff. So that's what we're doing here. And we're partially forecasting situation too, because I think if you just look at some of the guys around Gabe Davis, like there are other players who are better than him, who are behind him, but they're not playing in this offense. Like Juju Smith-Schuster is the only guy in a similar caliber of offense. So I think he has one of the widest variances of any player this year in my mind. Maybe he's just a touchdown machine, which he has been. He just turned 23 and he has 18 touchdowns and just over 120 targets in the regular season. So maybe he keeps being a touchdown machine and he gets higher volume and he's the starter in 2 receiver sets. So like that could be a top 15 season. Or he could struggle and maybe by November he's ranked 10 spots higher than Jamison Crowder because he's carved out a solid role in that offense. I could legitimately see both worlds, and I'm just so fascinated to see how that plays out this year.
I mean, I'm tired of the Gabriel Davis discourse. In like April, I was really excited to be all in on him, and then the entire like fantasy community went all in on him. His underdog ADP is all the way up to 21, which is above Brandon Cooks, Allen Robinson. It's too high for me. And this is probably a really boring take, but I think he wide receiver 28, 29, 30 probably belongs in that area. I mean, it's an upside wide receiver 2 play. That's what he is. We used to talk about year 3 being the breakout year, which is where he's at. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds with Gabriel Davis because everybody and their mother's doing it.
Yep.
But the runway is clear for him this year if he's going to make the final leap and be more than just like an end zone target and be a guy who can play between the 20s. And we are still forgetting that, and I think this is me stealing it from Matt Harmon. The answer to this offense could very well be just more Stephon Diggs.
Yeah,
Stephon Diggs
and that's kind of what I said in our top 12 show that, again, has not yet aired, but will soon. The other day when we were talking about Diggs is that we could just see more Diggs this year as well. Okay, the Dolphins. I don't want to go too long on the Dolphins because there are so many unknowns with this team that it's just really hard to nail down a storyline for me other than it's Tua. It all comes down to Tua. How good can he be? And that's going to be something that we're monitoring in training camp. We're going to be living and dying with every single beat report after every practice. Oh, how many picks did Tua throw today? Oh, he was 17 of 19 in this open session today. He looked great. Oh, he looked like he had never played football in his life before today. It's going to be just a roller coaster this next month. So that is definitely the story. Kind of a training camp story, which we'll talk more about training camp specific stories. But then that obviously bleeds into the season because even if he looks great in training camp, this is a guy who's been up and down, mostly down in the NFL so far. So we'll see if arguably two of like the best 5 deep threats in the league can unlock a guy who has a rocket arm, who showed that in college. I think where he struggles the most is where he has to make multiple reads over the middle, and he's just not proven capable of that yet. That's where he gets in trouble.
Yeah. Well, and Tua is the first quarterback I've ever seen us having beat reporters tweet air yards out about preseason camp. But I have the same storyline. Hua is Tua.
That's Tua.
Yeah, I like that one, right? I was going to do it with all of them, and I did not have the time. But I do think the investments in the wide receivers in this team are really rich for all the question marks around it. Tyreek Hill's wide receiver 7, Jalen Waddle's wide receiver 14. You're pricing in Jalen Waddle at where he was last year, and he just added an all NFL talent next to him. Mm-hmm. And then you're hoping that Tyreek Hill also repeats last year with a significant downgrade at quarterback. The offensive line got kind of better with Armstead, but they were so bad last year that there's a huge gap for them just to be okay. Yeah. And Armstead's never been a guy that's healthy. And then McDaniels coached a really good San Francisco team behind a really good offensive line, and everybody's doing like a 1-to-1 with these teams and what McDaniels is going to do. And the other thing is, and I didn't think I'd be doing this on the podcast, but they also had a really good intermediate passer in Jimmy Garoppolo, and that is legitimately where Tua is worst at, is intermediate throws. He's short and deep, and the entire Shanahan offense is like this intermediate throw into space.
Well, you would think that you would think they're going to recalibrate the offense, considering who the quarterback is and considering who their top 2 receivers are.
Yes, but I do not think that even with 3 years in the NFL, we really know what Tua's strengths are as a quarterback, or if he has any. To be completely honest. And that's not to hate on him. It's just he's not played a full season, and he has a lot of excuses around him. So
yeah, and some are valid, to be clear. He's been playing with one of the worst offensive lines.
Yes.
And he's been playing in, I think, a pretty easy to figure out and vanilla offense.
Yeah, so I'm glad to go for the cheaper options on this team. I don't really like the idea of taking Hill or Waddle at price right now, but like Edmonds, Sonny Michel, whatever they have in the running back room, and maybe Gesicki are guys that I'd be interested in just taking dart throws at, depending on price.
Yep. Okay. We go from one okay situation to a truly terrible one in New York, the Jets. Dalton, I think the main question for me is how good is Breece Hall really? Because, number one, he's the best guy on this team who is not tied to Zach Wilson in any way other than moving the football. He might catch some passes, but he doesn't have to rely on him consistently like the 2 young receivers who everybody loves, in Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson. And then obviously you've got the Michael Carter factor. So I think the Breece Hall, Michael Carter battle in training camp and also just throughout the season is probably going to be the biggest storyline on this team, because there's a world where neither one of these guys are too fun to use on a weekly basis because Michael Carter is RB35 and Breece Hall is RB24. Or there's a world where Breece Hall really emerges and takes over that role. And I don't know if we're going to learn that in training camp, which is why this is a whole season storyline for me. There's going to be ups and downs, ebbs and flows. There's going to be times that you can buy low and sell high on both these guys in this backfield, I think.
Well, it's funny, because my takeaway was Breece Hall and Michael Carter not Michael Carter-Williams, are going to finish in the top 30 at the end of season scoring for running backs.
Not impossible.
PFF right now has the Jets offensive line at 13th in their exceptional but not great tier. I think we get a full season of Zach Wilson, but more importantly, I think their defense gets a little better. We are coming from another Shanahan coaching tree. We go from Shanahan to Shanahan in the East. I do think they want to run the ball. They want to be effective with it. Their problem last year was their defense was so bad. They were getting run off the field. And then offensively, there was no continuity in that team. McKay Becton got injured very early on against the Panthers. Afterwards, their offensive line was really shambled together. You had Fant, who came on as a really good right tackle towards the end of the season. It's still probably their biggest question mark. But I think they're going to run the ball. They're going to give Zach Wilson easy looks and do a lot of play action. And the majority of their players outside of Elijah, even with Elijah Moore, their wide receivers are deep downfield threats for the most part. And I think Michael Carter feels a really good hole at their shorter to intermediate routes. And he can do that. And he proved he can do it at an NFL level. So I like him as their scat back in third down situations because they will be down in games. But I think they're going to play more close games. And Breece Hall has some really good high value touches to end the season.
Yeah, I agree with you that if in games that they're losing, it feels like Carter probably has more value in those games, but it's not out of the question that Breece Hall could just beat him out for the third down role too. I would be a little surprised if Carter was just completely relegated, but that's why it's going to be an interesting battle to watch all year. And with the Patriots, the next team, that's the only place I'm looking at on this team as well as the backfield. I just want to see how this backfield shakes out. Like, would it be the most shocking thing in the world to you if Damian Harris was traded before the season?
No, he's on the last year of his contract.
And they just drafted Pierre Strong, and I can't think of the second kid who they took like 1 or 2 rounds later in the draft. Yeah. And then obviously they have Ramondre Stevenson right now.
Yeah. Well, and that's my takeaway is it's Stevenson's season. I told you I tried it with some.
We're 2 for 4. I can't wait to see the rest.
So I know this is like beat reporter talk and Stevenson was running routes, but that is a very important storyline because James White's on the pup and was walking with a noticeable gait at their early practices. I don't think he's going to start the season, and there's a good chance James White just doesn't play anymore. That hip injury looks to be very nagging. Just like with last year, it's the same storyline. I like the cheaper back every time I can. Damian Harris is actually really inexpensive too, so you could probably get him in like round 7, but Stevenson's falling like to round 11. And the crazy stat I found on Stevenson was he's tied for number 1 in the league in rush yards over expectation last year. The only other player with him was Jonathan Taylor. And the reason we're not talking more about Stevenson is because week 1, he had 2 touches, fumbled the ball, and wasn't heard of for 5 straight games. Yep. I mean, he had to come back on and earn that role again, which takes a lot from Bill Belichick.
Yep, and that's what I wanted to say too. I think Stevenson actually outplayed Damian Harris down the stretch. It's just when you look back at the season, the counting stats favor Harris because he was there all year.
Exactly. And when it comes to high-value touches, Damian Harris only had 6 more goal line touches in the last 8 games of the season. So Damian Harris wasn't even really the goal line back. I owned both backs in fantasy last year, and what they would do is they would rotate entire drives. So at the end of the day, I like him just because he's cheaper. I don't mind taking Damian Harris. I do think this entire Patriots offense probably goes backwards this year and gets worse. But if I'm picking a player, it's probably Stevenson out of them.
I think Stevenson's just flat better than Damian Harris too. So there's that as well. And I mentioned, or I kind of wondered out loud if it would be shocking if Damian Harris is on the move. If J.K. Dobbins isn't ready for week 1, there's questions with Gus Edwards. Like I could totally see the Ravens being like, hey, we'll take Damian Harris for, whatever, halfway decent pick.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're just going to go straight into the AFC North now then.
Yeah. Let's go Bengals first. And I guess the thing that I'm watching here, and I mentioned this on our top 12 video that'll be coming out, is will the Bengals increase their passing rate similar to what they had during Burrow's rookie season? So in 2020, they were 64% pass rate and non-garbage time per PFF, 62.3% in 2021. But remember, in 2020, Burrow played 10, 11 weeks, something like that, and then got hurt. They had a 63.7% pass play rate after the week 10 bye this year, so slightly higher than their season after the bye. the first 11 weeks of 2020, they were almost at 68%. And now they have a better offensive line. They have 2 young star receivers. And we both mentioned in our video, it would be great for Joe Mixon if he could replace 4 carries with 1 or 2 receptions a game. So I think I'm just curious to see how this offense evolves this year, because I've seen Burrow as a regression candidate. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, because I think he's going to have more volume this year than he did last year.
Yeah, we really got to start comparing notes before the pod, because that is my question is, can Joe Burrow have a full season of higher pass yards? So just like you were talking about, last year, weeks 1 through 6, the Bengals were at a negative 12% pass rate over expectation. I think a lot of that is they were trying to manage Joe Burrow back into what he can be. By the end of the season, going into the playoffs, they were 14% over. So that's a full 26% swing in pass rate over expectation. If they have a full season where this offense is kind of uncorked, there's a really high ceiling to it. At the same time, I wonder if Joe Burrow can do a full season of that, and whether or not that's sustainable for him.
If he'll keep holding onto the football too long every time, you mean?
That's my point. He very famously on a podcast about 3 months ago said he sees sacks on 3rd down as a net positive, because they're just going to end up punting anyways if he doesn't get a good throw, which makes sense. But if you're dropping back 40 times a game and getting hit, like in the playoff game against the Titans 8 times, and you already have a torn ACL, it gets a little worrisome. And as a coaching staff, you probably want to protect your franchise quarterback. And I could very likely see them going back to a more run-heavy option if Joe Burrow is just holding the ball for too long.
Yeah, I will say, even though Mixon is awesome, they were one of the teams, and I don't remember where I saw this graph sometime recently, where they were, awesome passing the ball and actually not very good running the ball. So they were like one of the teams highlighted, like, hey, they really should pass the ball more. They should have passed the ball more in the Super Bowl too, and that probably cost them that game.
Well, it definitely cost them that game, especially putting in P-Ryan.
Yes, P-Ryan was probably the big error there. But okay, the Browns, and you know what? Unless you have a lot to say on them, I just kind of want to hold off for the most part on this team, because it just all depends on what happens with Deshaun Watson, right? Like, if he gets 4 games, 6 games, 8 games, the whole season, doesn't get suspended for 8 games, then gets 8 at the end of the season. We have no idea what's going to happen at this point. It does really no good to speculate. I'll say 2 things before I'll hand it over to you, see if you have anything. Is number 1, it was interesting to see that they had conversations about Jimmy Garoppolo previously, and that popped up again on Twitter yesterday. So that'll be something they'll at least monitor, and would make sense as an upgrade over his former teammate Jacoby Brissett at quarterback. They did just sign Josh Rosen, so they're really padding the depth chart there. And then
first rounders.
If Jacoby Brissett is the quarterback for the full season, I think Amari Cooper is going to get dropped down about 15 to 20 spots in my ranks. Those are my 2 things.
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say, just kind of adding to the Jimmy Garoppolo discourse, the Browns trade with the Panthers for Baker Mayfield legitimately opened up enough cap space for them to pay Jimmy Garoppolo's contract, which is why it's very interesting, because there's not a lot out there in free agency anymore. So very interesting there.
It's pretty much either there or the Seahawks. Those are like the only 2.
Yeah.
The musical chairs were stopped everywhere else. Everyone else has a seat.
And in all honesty, it makes the most sense for Jimmy Garoppolo to want to play in Cleveland, because it probably fits his skill set best in a heavy play action, good offensive line team. Second of all, I mean, I agree with you. I don't want to talk about this team until we know about Watson. But if you're doing like underdog and you're looking for some arbitrage plays, if Deshaun Watson somehow avoids a full year suspension, you can get any of the other wide receivers on this team for so cheap. Anthony Schwartz is 111 in ADP for wide receivers. Donovan Peoples-Jones is wide receiver 77.
Or even like, I bet David Njoku can't be too expensive either. He's probably like 15 to 18 somewhere in there, would be my guess.
Yeah, and then David Bell's wide receiver 82. So you can just grab them like the 17th round if you're looking for like an arbitrage play and Watson's back and they're fighting for a playoff spot. But that's really my only advice here. If you're in a redraft league, I wouldn't draft any Browns until you know anything. I would just let them fall at ADP.
I would tell my league, can we please wait until we know until we know the Deshaun Watson news? Thank you. Okay, Dalton, the Ravens, I'll let you start us off. What are you watching with this team?
there's a ton of storylines here that I'd rather get into on different pods. So I'm just going to punt on this one and say Nevermore Lamar. Right now he's QB5 in ADP. He needs to be like QB3 or 2. I don't understand people putting like Kyler Murray in front of Lamar Jackson because they're kind of the same player, but Kyler's worse at everything he does than Lamar. Maybe deep balls. Lamar is probably going to be like my most loved quarterback because he's the cheapest of the top of the top of the top, the Mahomes, the Allen, and Jackson, in my opinion.
Yep.
And he wasn't even bad last year. The problem was he was hurt.
Yeah.
If you watch the Colts game, I mean, you saw why he was MVP. Against the Colts last year, he went 43 of 37, 450 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, and 62 rush yards for 42 fantasy points. Like, I don't know what world you're not drafting him and what world you're like. Even I would probably put him above Mahomes at this point just because of offensive concerns with Mahomes compared to Lamar. I mean, he's probably my QB too. If
I have all three of those guys kind of in the same tier. So
Yeah.
I think it's reasonable to argue any of them. I'm cheating. I'm basically taking what would be my number one training camp storyline and just inserting it into today, only because it's timely with all the J.K. Dobbins stuff that happened earlier this week. So for anyone who hasn't seen this or isn't like completely up to date, Ian Rappaport said on TV and then maybe again on Twitter, but on TV, and then it got tweeted out that Dobbins is no sure thing for week 1. And he basically reiterated that the injury was a serious one, which I do think people forget. It was ACL, and then it damaged his LCL too, which was supposed to lengthen his recovery and just make it more of an injury risk in general. So I think people forget that part. Then J.K. Dobbins goes on Twitter and says, exact words here, I might not even go on the PUP because that's how good my rehab is going. And I'm damn sure going to be ready by week 1. Dalton, why do we think the Ravens stuff, the J.K. Dobbins stuff came out from Ian Rappaport? Who could have told him, I wonder?
Well, and I'm glad you put the storyline on here, and I thought you would. The Ravens did, and we know the Ravens did because they're clearly trying to manage expectations with Dobbins.
Hold on. Why would the Ravens do that?
Why would they do that?
Why would the Ravens do that? Because they're trying to lower expectations for a guy coming back from a serious injury. And the main reason I wanted to talk about it is because I saw multiple people, like analysts, like people who have the blue check marks, say either on Twitter or on their websites, I feel a lot better now after Dobbins came out and said what he said. It's like, really? You do? I think you have to take the team at a lot more face value than the player at this point. And this is just going to be something we have to watch for the next month. Does he start on the PUP? How does he look in camp? How many days off is he getting? It's just, there's going to be so much to keep up with this. And I don't think you should say, okay, everything is fine now after Dobbins fired back.
Well, and Dobbins doesn't have a say in the matter. I mean, he's a rookie running back in the NFL. No one really wants to trade for a guy coming off an injury. It's not like he can hold out on a rookie contract. And the Ravens get final say if he's going to play. And we've seen this all offseason. You and me have been very skeptical of both players in this backfield coming off ACL tears because they brought in Melvin Gordon. They drafted Tyler Batty. They had a ton of prospective running backs come into that room. And
they signed Mike Davis. He's the one who ultimately ends up there of the veterans.
It's very clear the Ravens do not feel comfortable with that backfield. I do not feel comfortable with it. This could be a situation where you go into like week 3 or 4 and we're wondering where Dobbins is, or he's getting 8 or 9 carries a game, and as a fantasy manager, you hate your life because you're going to draft him in the 5th round.
Yeah, I think this is going to be obviously a training camp storyline for the reasons I said. You're just going to have – I'm not ready to jump to any grand conclusions yet. I don't think you are either. I want to see how this plays out in camp over the next month or so. And then during the season, if he does start off slow like that, he is going to be now it's going to take some guts, but he's going to be a buy low guy that if he does actually hit and bounce back, you could win your league if he starts off that slow and his manager is that worried, which, I mean, it could also blow up in your face and cost you your league too. Like, it's just going to be a fascinating situation to watch all season.
Yeah. And would love to hear about Gus the Bus's ACL recovery because he is a guy I would like to draft.
All right, the Steelers. I have a feeling we may have the same storyline here.
I think we do.
Mine is Deontay Johnson still going to be treated like the top priority on this team? Is that yours?
Mine's a little bolder, but it's in the same vein.
Okay. So this team has pretty much said we're not paying him after this year. A Steelers beat writer whose name escapes me pretty much said, yeah, he's not going to be here next year on a recent podcast that I listened to.
Well, and that's not just so anybody listening is aware. I don't remember the name of the beat writer either, but that beat writer is basically a mouthpiece for the Steelers organization. He is the Brian Schefter of the Steelers, or the Adam Schefter of the Steelers. Brian Windhorst and Adam Schefter just combined forces there. But
why would they do that?
Why would they do that?
I'm going to abuse that. I think Deontay Johnson is an outstanding player. I do think a lot of people agree that maybe he was propped up a bit by a guy in Big Ben who had no arm, couldn't move, and didn't want to be hit. And Deontay Johnson is great at getting open quickly. Now, I will say the opposite could also be true. Deontay Johnson could have also been held back by Big Ben. We don't really know that yet. But what we do know is Chase Claypool, I think, has a more elite just talent profile. He has not produced like Deontay Johnson has, but he did score 13 touchdowns as a rookie. And then you have Pickens, who was a very polarizing prospect, who I think if he didn't have the knee injury, probably would have been one of the top 3 receivers drafted.
Most annoying evaluation I've ever done in my life.
Yeah, I mean, people were all over the place with him. And the thing is, when he goes to the Steelers, and I'm like, okay, I kind of have to trust it a little bit because their track record is just so good picking receivers over the last couple of decades. And you have Hines Ward, Emmanuel Sanders, obviously Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool now, Antonio Brown being the biggest one. I feel like Santonio Holmes, I believe, was another one too. They nail their receiver picks. I know Claypool has been rightfully scapegoated for basically not being an adult yet. I think that's kind of allowed Deontay Johnson to fly under the radar with his drops a little bit. I don't remember. I think it may have been Adam Levitan made this crack the other day that Claypool was getting eviscerated in the game that he had like 80 yards and celebrated the first down too long when Deontay Johnson dropped 2 touchdowns in that game. So there is a little bit of that going on. I just think Johnson is playing with one guy who is more talented than him from a pure athlete standpoint, and another who, I mean, maybe could be. He's not going to get paid by the team. They also drafted Calvin Austin, just another body. I'm just curious to see the pecking order and how those guys line up this year because there's no slot guy right now. Maybe Chase Claypool becomes that guy. Maybe Calvin Austin's that guy, and those other 2 are on the outside. We'll see.
Well, I was willing to go on a farther limb and say I'm going to draft Claypool and no Deontay Johnson this year.
Well, Claypool is much cheaper to the tune of about 30 spots at receiver.
And that's fitting for me to pick the cheaper option because it's easier to be right when they're less expensive. But Deontay right now in normal people drafts is going 40 right now. So right around the 3-4 turn, and I think that's really expensive because with Big Ben, he could kind of hit that upside and he was kind of safer there. Claypool's going at 105. So, I mean, he's basically for free in most leagues. And last year,
he's not quite free, but you're not drafting him as a starter.
Exactly. So you can just wait and see. With Deontay, you're like, I need you to produce week 1 with a rookie quarterback in a bad offensive environment.
I think it'll probably be Mitch Trubisky, but yeah.
Well, then Nickelodeon Player of the Year. But Big Ben had the lowest ADOT of any quarterback in the last to start all 17 games last year.
Deontay's was like 6 as a result of that.
Well, and it matched Deontay's play style because Deontay was coming off the line and doing a curl route, and then Claypool is running go routes in this offense. Well, unfortunately, when you're running a go route with a quarterback who throws the ball in a half second, you're never going to be open. It's impossible.
Well, and Matt Harmon's pointed this out. Claypool is truly terrible when it comes to contested catches, which is pretty puzzling given how big and strong and fast he is. You would think that he'd be good at that, but he has not been so far.
And the other issue is that there was no play action in this offense to create separation amongst wide receivers. It was all contested catches. Like you just said, Claypool's just not a contested catch wide receiver, but a play action is what gives your wide receiver the chance to create separation. Despite that, last year, Chase Claypool was 28th in the league in separation. in an
Yeah.
offense.
Well, and it was Big Ben's offense last year, the last couple of years. It'll be Matt Canada's now, and it's funny. We always get the storylines with the Steelers the last couple of years with Ben. It's like, okay, they're gonna run jet sweeps now. Like we're really getting crazy. Like you start getting Chase Claypool on jet sweeps, and things get a little interesting.
Yeah, Big Ben was just a dinosaur in the NFL at that point. He didn't like the way the new NFL was played. There was hardly any motion in the offense. There was hardly any play action. All of those things lend themselves to Claypool's play style and Deontay Johnson in a lesser sense, but it's just Claypool can really shine in an environment where he wasn't allowed to, as long as he doesn't celebrate first downs or go to bars and fight people and do all of that.
I'm just curious to see what the pecking order ends up being this year. And if it is still Deontay, Claypool, and then insert third guy, if it's Deontay by a wide margin or if it's pretty indistinguishable between those two guys. I think
it could be like Claypool Muth. You never know.
That would be nice for some people. Okay. The AFC South, the Colts, Dalton.
Can we just like skip this entire division?
The only thing I want to say on the Colts is, will there be a third guy that we should care about in Indianapolis besides quarterback? Just talking position players, you have Michael Pittman and you have Jonathan Taylor. Is there a third guy? I think if Alec Pierce and Naheem Hines are like those are probably the top two candidates. Paris Campbell being a candidate, maybe Jelani Woods at tight end if you're getting really frisky. But
Mo Alley's still good. Him and
true.
Jelani Woods are literally the same player for what it's worth.
So I think what will probably happen is it's just a committee of guys, and then it's really nobody you can trust, and it'll just be about hitting the right week if you're putting one of them in your lineup for whatever reason. But if one of them were to emerge above the others, there is some value to be had. So that's really the main thing I'll be watching.
Yeah, I will say out of all of them, this is going to be much to the chagrin of Eli, loved listener. I think it's Paris Campbell because he's a
I disagree.
Player.
I put.
I know you. I know.
I'll bet you right now, straight up, Alec Pierce versus Paris Campbell. Electric bet to start off the season.
I'm making the bet. I need Campbell to stay healthy, which is the biggest problem. But I think if he stays healthy, he's going to do it, and he's going to be the guy. But I'll take the bet because that is such. Just a lovely July bet. It makes all the sense that no one's going to be talking about these guys come September. That I'll take it right now.
Paris Campbell get hurt like in week 4, and Alec Pierce will have played like 5 games by week 11.
Exactly.
They'll be like our Paul Perkins versus Jeff Janis bet.
Oh, that was such a good bet. My real takeaway though is Michael Pittman. It's wide receiver 1 season. Yeah. Last year with a bad quarterback, he had over 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns. He's one of only 11 wide receivers with 25% of the team's targets and 30% of the air yards. And go look up like how Matt Ryan targets his wide receiver ones because he just targets the living heck out of them.
Yep.
Obviously, Julio Jones like kind of skews that a little bit, but even with Calvin Ridley in their limited time together, it's like a 33% target share. And he's not Julio Jones, but Michael Pittman has put up really good NFL numbers with some really bad quarterbacking.
Well, and perhaps most importantly, he's clearly the top receiver on this team.
Yeah, there's nobody contesting him for that. So I think he's one of those guys I'd probably reach for at the end of the second round in drafts if he's there. I haven't looked at non-smart people ADP recently, so I don't know how low he's fallen because he's not a sexy pick. But I think he's like a dark horse top 5 wide receiver candidate this year.
Well, I can tell you I have my draft, or I have the Colts preview up right now. He has wide receiver 16 on Fantasy Pros.
Yeah, so last year Cooper Kupp was actually wide receiver 16, and I would say Pittman has like an outside shot of being this year's Cooper Kupp if we're doing that really tiring narrative.
I love that narrative. All right, the Jaguars. Can Trevor Lawrence take a step forward? I think that is actually multiple steps forward. And I think kind of like the Dolphins, that is really what matters here. They have fewer good players than the Dolphins. But if Lawrence is anywhere close to the same level he was last year, which was very bad, Travis Etienne is going to be the only guy we care about on this roster this year, I think. They spent all kinds of money to remake that pass catching group, which, say what you will about the actual caliber of guys they brought in and the money that, like the contract they gave Christian Kirk, it's still an upgrade. They still have major upgrades at receiver compared to last year. If anyone's seen the video going around, it was in the Texans Jaguars preview on the newsletter. that Ian Hartitz put out, they had their receivers just had some brutal drops last year. But even so, there was literally nothing you could point to last year and say that Lawrence was good besides a couple of flash plays. Like the play where he dropped the snap and threw the touchdown to Marvin Jones was probably the best play of the season last year. For him, the coaching should be much better. So he's got that going for him. The offensive line, hopefully a little bit better. The weapons should be better as well. I think ETN will help him too. I told you I had Trevor Lawrence stat to pull up in a bookmark tweet. That's from Warren Sharp. 284 quarterbacks have had 500 or more attempts since 2000. Trevor Lawrence's touchdown to interception ratio was 5th worst among 284 quarterbacks in the last 22 years or 21 years. And it was the 2nd worst by any rookie in that stretch. So It was bad last year. But this was a generational prospect coming out. There is definitely still hope that he can improve, and he's going to have to elevate anybody, including himself, in the fantasy relevance besides Travis Etienne.
Yeah. And my takeaway is actually just draft a Jagger here in your draft because they're so cheap. You can really get just about any of them. Etienne's probably the most expensive with like a 6th round ADP. I think Christian Kirk is a really good pick because the money's there and they're probably going to want to make that look worthwhile. But just to tell you how bad this team is, last year before the bye, they averaged 1.8 touchdowns per game.
I thought you were going to say 1.8 points per game. Like, you know what? I believe it.
No, 1.8 touchdowns per game, which is bad. Don't get me wrong. Post-bye, which is normally when teams and more importantly rookies get better, they averaged 0.6 touchdowns per game. They got worse. You can't really do that. It's very hard to do in the NFL. Especially with you having the bye week.
In case you forgot, there was some turmoil during the season. I think the head coach may have
been fired. I don't recall. He might have stayed in Ohio.
Yeah, may have went to a bar, perhaps.
Yeah. So I do like just taking dart throws at some of the players on this team. The one player that I'm not going to take a dart throw at, not even in like underdog drafts, am I bothering to draft him, is Laviska Shenault. Yeah. It's just over. Like he needs to get traded, and that's your only hope, and he hasn't. He's a slot player. They have like 6 slot players. This coaching staff is not impressed with him. The last wasn't impressed with him. He has such a specific usage pattern that you need the right team to use it. So I'm ready to call it.
Those rumors about him to the Chiefs were exciting for about 5 seconds there.
I think I was the main arbiter of those rumors.
No, Nate Taylor. Nate
Taylor
you're
right.
Was throwing those out too. So that was a guy that they were targeting. So it wasn't just you. The last thing I'll say on this team is I think James Robinson would have to be proven to be like Hercules himself for me to draft him at RB39 at this point. Why are we doing this? This guy tore his Achilles not much earlier than Chris Godwin tore his ACL.
I was looking at that, and I couldn't make sense of his ADP. In underdog, it's like 70. It's really low. Yeah. But in non-underdog leagues, it's very high.
Yeah, it's RB39 on Fantasy Pros as of 2 days ago.
And there's a very high chance he doesn't play till December when it's not important where your team's at. Like
he could just miss the whole season. Like that's not possible.
He very well could. And this isn't like I know like I was pretty down on James Robinson until Etienne got hurt last year, but do not draft him. He's a running back coming off an Achilles injury, and he is not Cam Akers, who had an ungodly recovery and still is a very questionable fantasy pick at RB19.
We'd have to see some miraculous stuff in this preseason for that, even anything around that price to make sense to me.
Absolutely. I agree.
Okay, the Broncos, I think where this starts and ends is...
Are we just skipping the Titans and the Texans?
Oh, yeah. No, Titans, Texans. You're right. You're right. I really wanted to move on from this division.
We should just move quickly through these two. But
right,
wow, Evan.
Texans, Brandon Cooks. I'm just curious if this ADP is going to inflate as we get closer to the season. Wide receiver 24, up 1 spot from earlier this week. Can't help but think my team preview bumped him up 1 spot. Wide receiver 17 last year. He has 6 1,000-yard seasons in 8 years. Davis Mills in weeks 13 through 18 was QB 12 last year. Not saying I'm expecting that, but I am expecting like a competent situation for Brandon Cooks. And I'll say give me Cooks over the uncertainty of a guy like Amari Cooper, who's in the mid-teens right now, all day, every day. The last 4 games of the season last year, that mostly coincided with Davis Mills being good. Cooks was 11th in points per game, top 5 in targets per route run at 33%, and that's with him missing one game in that stretch, so that's why I pulled out points per game. I think he was like wide receiver 14 or something like that while even missing a game. So he was awesome down the stretch. He's going to be awesome again this year. He's a value right now. Curious to see if that value goes away in the next month.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. Big Brandon Cooks lover over here. My takeaway was that Davis Mills is the most proven 2021 fantasy quarterback out of that 2021 quarterbacking class.
Yep, it's close between he and Mac Jones. Crazy as that sounds.
Yeah. I mean, Brandon Cooks had the highest finish of any wide receiver with any of those quarterbacks. Meanwhile, there are guys going above him who are going to have rookie quarterbacks. Debo, I understand why Debo's going that high. Don't get me wrong, but he's getting Trey Lance. There's some question there. Christian Kirk is going at 31 right now with a rookie or a second-year quarterback. Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, Travis Etienne, and even Elijah Moore all have these inflated price tags, and then Brandon Cooks is deflating. And I don't understand that. And I think that people are really disrespecting Davis Mills, and I just want to be on record. I do respect Davis Mills. I like the
I respect him and his very long neck.
Yes. I also think that like Nico Collins is a sneaky late round pick. If Davis Mills takes another step forward, this is the only quarterback who proved he could throw for 300 yards, like on repeated occasions.
Well, I said in my preview that obviously you're not drafting him, but John Mechie is a guy that I would maybe like the pre-waiver wire is a thing in fantasy football, like going and picking up a guy like a week or two before he's going to be back from injury. If he does miss games, which I would expect he probably would, he tore his ACL at the very end of the season last year. He'll probably be like an October-ish type of guy when he's back. I would pick him up and stash him if you've got the room just to see how it plays out, because he's not going to be a star in the NFL, but he's at least going to be a good slot receiver, I think. And those are the types of guys who can sometimes translate much quicker than the guys with the higher upside in the draft classes, but are more raw.
Yeah, the team's going to build. They're better than they were last year. I think they're going to be one of the teams that people are like, oh, the Texans like actually are putting up consistent points and like there's some fantasy relevance on them. Nothing sexy. Don't get me wrong. Cook's a little sexy. The rest of the team not. But there's going to be contributors for people who need stand-ins on bye weeks.
Well, here's my hot take. Texans and Titans are going to be battling for second in this division. I think the Titans are going to be bad. Their over-under is like 9.5. I'm hard on that under. And then just with the fantasy takeaway, it's like Derrick Henry and who else? What else do we have going on in this offense, Dalton? Traylon Burks, like I don't think the asthma's as much of a thing as much as he's just out of shape and Mike Vrabel is pissed off about that.
Yeah, I went just way down Takester on this one because it's Robert Woods, wide receiver 1 season for me. Sounds like he's going to be back. His ACL tear was early enough that he should be able to play, and his rehab's ahead of schedule based on what I was reading on The Athletic. He has the highest blocking grade of any wide receiver the last 2 seasons, and I know like that's not a fantasy stat, but if you recall, Julio Jones lost snaps in this offense last year because of poor blocking, and that's Julio freaking Jones. So Woods is going to be the every down wide receiver. He had the 4th highest separation on play action passes last year before the ACL tear. And that's a really, really good stat in this team that runs a lot of play action and needs highly efficient players. And my last note here is just Traylon Burks might already be washed.
Let's not go that far.
But this wide receiver room is so open for a vet like him to take it. And it's just going to be like a Brandon Cooks-esque scenario where he's going to be the guy who gets the targets and gets the plays. And he is a talented receiver who's going to do well in this offense. And right now his ADP is wide receiver 43. So he's basically free. Like he's going below Drake London. And I think that Ryan Tannehill's proven more than Marcus Mariota that he can at least sustain a wide receiver.
Well, he's been better in Tennessee than Marcus Mariota, that's for sure. I am a little worried about Woods just because that's a 32-year-old receiver coming back from a torn ACL. So I'm just a little skeptical that we're going to see the version of Robert Woods that we remember. But if we do, then that's going to turn into a great value. I mentioned this on the Top 12 show that will be out soon, but Derrick Henry averaged an absurd 27.4 carries per game last season. And I'm just curious, are they going to finally dial it back? Like I said, I think they're going to be battling with the Texans for second place, and that's not a compliment in this division. I think both teams are going to be bad. Does Tannehill get the whole season this year? Does Malik Willis start any games at any point this year? Like somebody outside of Henry is going to have to step up to make this offense decent. Otherwise, the rebuild might be on quicker than people think.
And I think this team should go into rebuild. The only problem is they have a good enough coach who like gets them just there every year in Mike Vrabel. But this team sucks on paper. I mean, it really does.
Yep. At least on offense. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely on offense.
Okay, we're finally to the AFC West. Makes sense to save the best division for last when we're trying to press for time. The Broncos, Dalton, I think what this all comes down to, I wanted to save some of the training camp, like what I'm watching for their receivers until next week. The biggest overarching storyline is going to be, can Russ still cook? I think the answer is yes, but it does seem like everybody is just saying it's going to happen and he's going to automatically go back to being awesome when he was not good for big chunks of last year. I know there were a lot of reasons. He was good to start the year, then he had the injury, and then he came back too soon. But he wasn't like great down the like by Russell Wilson standards. He was not great down the stretch. I think the answer is yes, but the level that he plays at is going to either make the ADPs for these guys turn into steals because kind of like the Chiefs, we don't know what to do with these guys.
Or do we?
So they're kind of bunched up, the top two, and then Tim Patrick is lower down. But like, if Russell Wilson's awesome, then Courtland Sutton's going to be a value. I can tell you that already right now. And he's going to make people feel dumb for doubting these guys to the extent that we are. Or if he's just not as good as we thought this year, we're going to feel dumb just as a whole, ranking like 6 guys in the top like 120 like we are with this team.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to like the Bengals probably are an example of this last year where there were values there and then they showed out because their quarterback was good. He was just hurt. Different injuries, but same. Are we ready for flag plant season? Because I talked about this a little bit earlier today on Twitter, but I'm ready. Don't draft Jerry Jeudy. Just don't do it. I think that this wide receiver room has 2 alphas, and their names are Courtland Sutton and Tim Patrick.
Man, I like Tim Patrick. I don't think he's an alpha, though, I will say. But I will say they did pay Tim Patrick. Jerry Jeudy is the guy that hasn't got the investment yet.
Well, you can blame Evan Silva for this take. But first, this front office is a new front office. Didn't draft Jerry Jeudy. Doesn't always mean a lot with wide receivers, but they paid Tim Patrick. They paid him wide receiver money, like starting money.
And it was like 3 years, like 34, 36 million, something like that.
And Courtland Sutton is 1 year removed from everybody thinking he was going to be a breakout. The reason he didn't break out was he tore his ACL, and then he played, and this entire wide receiver room played with absolutely horrendous quarterbacking last year. He is a huge, big body separator in the red zone, really fits the archetype for Russell Wilson on his downfield throws. And then it just feels right with Tim Patrick. Like
Tim Patrick does just produce whenever he's called upon.
Well, and that's the thing is that Russell Wilson in Seattle had to be so efficient that all of his wide receivers from Lockett to Baldwin to Metcalf were these like efficiency freaks, like 4 for 4 for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, games like that. And those are like Tim Patrick stat lines. It just makes sense.
Except the Drew Lock version of that is 4 catches for 45 yards and 1 touchdown.
Yes. And the last thing, and like this is probably like the offense as a whole, but I went and dug this up just to have a point. Jerry Jeudy's like yards per separation dropped 0.2 last year, which is pretty significant from a statistical standpoint.
To give a little pro Jeudy, or at least non-negative Jeudy here.
Don't want to hear it.
He had the high ankle sprain in week 1. Everyone thought this guy was like the next big thing the first 3/4 of week 1 last year when he looked awesome. And then he got hurt, and then he wasn't. The team had just fallen apart, and he wasn't as good by the time he got back.
But I'm flag planting it. I'm going to put Jerry Jeudy at like wide receiver 28, and put Sutton at like wide receiver 12, and Tim Patrick might put him in the top 36.
I was gonna say that's what I wanted to hear because Tim Patrick, if you have him in the 50s, it's like, wow, this guy loves Tim Patrick. I've not seen him anywhere above the 50s yet.
Yeah, I think I'm flag planting.
Although I don't have access to Evan. I don't have access to Evan Silva's ranks because I have to pay money for those. So,
well, he went on The Athletic and he talked very negative, not negatively, but he flag planted for Sutton and Patrick and let Jerry Jeudy out to dry.
Okay, Dalton, the Chargers. I'm interested in how this balance is going to work out. Justin Herbert improvement versus regression for Austin Eckler and Mike Williams. You're nodding your head.
Am I out on the Chargers like entirely? I think maybe Isaiah Spiller, but when you look at this team,
I bookmarked this tweet just for you. Austin, this is from the Fantasy Footballers. Jonathan Taylor had 89 red zone rushing attempts, the most of all time. Yet Eckler, with 40 fewer carries, outpaced Taylor in fantasy points inside the red zone. His 10 fantasy points per game in the red zone was the second best over the last decade.
That's absurd, first of all. But second of all, this team feels like fool's gold. And I'm going to say it. It's not a fact of I like Justin Herbert a lot. I think he's very good. I don't think he's the problem.
You're a cranky old man who hates analytics and Brandon Staley. I get
No, what I hate is Keenan Allen turned 32. Can he keep it up? We just had the same concerns with Robert Woods. Then Mike Williams, I know
Keenan Allen is not coming off of an ACL repair,
yes,
to be clear.
But you just expect some regression at those ages. I'm not saying he's going to put up like 500 yards, but I'm saying, there's some problems there. If he gets hurt or Mike Williams gets hurt, that wide receiver room sucks. I mean, I love Josh Palmer for his price, but he's not a wide receiver 2 right now. And then it's Jalen Guyton. Austin Eckler, efficiency king, is also getting relatively old for a running back. Who's their red zone target? Jared Cook's gone. I think
Donald Parham. People are excited about him.
We'll see if he can play after the last time he was on the field and got carted off. It didn't look good. I really like Isaiah Spiller, and that's the player I'm going to draft on this team because I think they're still going to score points. I think this, out of every team, and I want to look closer at it, has the most inflated ADPs, and I think offensively they're the most likely to regress because I really last year I loved Mike Williams. This year he's very expensive, and I don't really trust Mike Williams at that price tag.
See, Mike Williams is either a value or a bust, and I can't decide which because, I think Herbert is still going to keep getting better because most young quarterbacks do, a guy of that caliber. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to have better numbers. You can get better as a football player and not put up better stats than the year before.
Yes.
But he also could put up better stats. I think we both agree Eckler's regressing. He's not scoring 24 total touchdowns or whatever it was. Mike Williams just had over 1,000 yards for the first time in his career. It's tempting to say that he won't do that. But if Eckler's regressing and Keenan Allen is getting older, who else? Mike Williams, I think I really like him. I think Josh Palmer, could he have some value? Could he solidify himself above Guyton this year? I think where I'm going to ultimately land is that we're too low on Mike Williams, who was the wide receiver 10 last year and scored 4 more points than Keenan Allen, who I don't know where he's going, an underdog on your price, but on
they're
Fantasy
12
Pros,
and 13 right
he's
now.
19 on Fantasy Pros right now.
Keenan or Mike?
Mike. Keenan is wide receiver 12, I think, on Fantasy Pros.
See, that feels better than wide receiver 13.
See, I actually kind of think that's where he should be, is around that 13-ish range.
And I'm not ready to go all the way there yet, but I think that this offense is going to be a fantasy disappointment as a whole. It's
possible. I'm just trying to put the puzzle pieces together, and I see a lot of things that I have a tough time thinking are going to repeat this year, but then they've got one of the best 8 quarterbacks.
They do. And maybe it's some fresh blood in the system. Maybe it's Isaiah Spiller. Maybe that's the answer. But
gosh. Okay.
I don't know. I need more time with the Chargers. It is also the Chargers, which every year are like a preseason darling and then fall to pieces by October. So
That's
it is
true.
what it is.
Although that didn't quite happen last year. Let's
You're
go
right.
let's go out of order. And it was Travis Kelce actually who destroyed their season last year. Let's
Well,
go
and
out
the
of
Raiders.
order. Yep. Okay. And the Raiders. Let's go out of order and do the Raiders. We'll get the Chiefs last before we jump out of here. And I think the biggest question that I have is how much does Davante Adams elevate this offense and specifically Derek Carr? I think Derek Carr, you guys talked about that 30 over under. I think he's hitting that this year. I think he's been on the borderline of QB starter in fantasy leagues the last couple of years. Like when you say QB 13, I literally think of Derek Carr in my head, which coincidentally, that's what he finished last year was QB 13. They do still have Josh Jacobs, but the strength of this offense has drastically shifted to receiver with obviously Waller. Renfro is a bona fide stud at this point, and Davante Adams is probably the best receiver in the NFL or top 2 or 3 at least right now. They have 56% pass play rate on non-garbage time situations last year per PFF. In Carr's near MVP season, I think they were like low 60s. So maybe that should elevate, I would think, this year. Carr is kind of a sneaky QB 10 type of guy, I think, maybe this year. What concerns you is that he started off so well last year and was still like only QB 11 and then faded down the stretch. But Henry Ruggs was not on the team down the stretch, which I think hurt that offense too.
You know, this is another team where it's like they're going to probably be really good because they have so many weapons. And McDaniels seems to be a good offensive coordinator and a good head coach. But you're paying a lot of money for Davante Adams, and that's about it, which I really like. What I am confused about and want to talk about is what is going on in this running back room and who do you draft? Josh Jacobs right now is almost where he was last year.
I think you draft Josh Jacobs, but you feel real bad about it.
He's RB22 on Underdog right now. And like,
well, Dalton, they didn't pick up his 5th year option.
Why would they do that?
Why? Which is that like, is there a non-zero chance that like Josh Jacobs is like the second running back on the field? Like one of like Zaquandre White starts above him. Kenyon Drake plays above him. I mean,
I do not think that will happen, but I don't think he's long for this franchise. They've shifted their investment on the offensive side to receiver and tight end, and they're just not going to be able to pay Jacobs. Like he's not going to command huge money, but he'll command enough money to where it just doesn't make sense, and they probably literally cannot pay him.
Are you going to draft him at ADP? He's 22 right now, running backs on Underdog. Would you draft that? Just so you know,
maybe like who? Yeah, that's just in the range of like who else am I taking there that I feel good. That's why everyone's like, all right, Travis Etienne, new guy, come on, new guy.
Well, you got Breece Hall, Cam Akers.
You know what? I think I've done a full 180. I think I'm in on Cam Akers this year.
All right, let's go underneath them because they were one spot above a piece. Elijah Mitchell or Josh Jacobs?
Well, you know, I think Elijah Mitchell is like going to be on my bust list. I've had that since April.
Yeah, I think Jacobs might be on my bust list. Fun times. AJ Dillon. Wow, we're getting into backup territory. AJ Dillon or Josh Jacobs?
Oh.
Antonio Gibson, Miles Sanders, Tony Pollard, CH round out underneath him.
I would definitely take Gibson over Jacobs, but I think I would take Jacobs over Dillon, but I don't feel good about it, and that tells you how far we've fallen because as much as I like Dillon, he's not the clear top guy, and that's on that team by any means.
Damian Harris at 29.
I would still take Jacobs over Damian Harris because I don't think Damian Harris is the best running back on his own team.
I don't think the team believes in Josh Jacobs. I don't think anybody in the NFL has believed in Josh Jacobs since he came into it, but you. The way he's been treated by his coaching staffs and front offices, I think you might be like the Jacobs truther.
You know what? Bring him to Kansas City. 1-year deal on the cheap. Bring him home. He deserves to be in KC.
Are we down to the best team in the division?
We're down to the Chiefs. I'm going to guess we have similar things we're watching here. I think the wide receiver totem pole in Kansas City is one of the stories in fantasy football. as far as specific things that I'm watching for, we'll save that for next week. But really, I just want it'll be so important for the season for this team. Do any of them separate from the pack? How many of them are relevant fantasy wise this year? It's a little bit like the Broncos, where nobody is too high in ADP, but just a little bit of a lower scale, besides Kelsey, obviously, as a pass catcher, because nobody feels comfortable in declaring any of these guys as like the top one or two. And I think this is one of the biggest opportunities for value, like with right there with the Packers in fantasy football this year. If Juju, I'm going off Fantasy Pros here, if he doesn't finish higher than his wide receiver 34 ADP, I can almost guarantee you that at least one of Sky Moore, MVS, or McCole Hardman will have a top 50 season. And none of those guys are going in the top 50. There is no shot that what their ADP is will be how it actually shakes out. I think we're either going to see multiple guys elevate into the starter realm, or we're going to see Juju as a top like 15 to 20 receiver if those other guys are all in the 50s. That's what I think.
We do have the same takeaway. Other one, I don't want to talk about because it's CEH related. And that's been a 3-year issue.
Speaking of guys who only people on this podcast believe in.
Post-hype sleeper ? But my takeaway is don't draft Marquez Valdez-Scantling out of this room. I am not a believer.
I think you're going to see some training camp buzz for him because we've seen some off-season buzz for him.
I trust Nate Taylor, but Nate Taylor also led me to Noah Gray, and that's not working out for me.
To be fair, he didn't tell you to draft Noah Gray in fantasy football.
Anyways, right now in underdog ADP, Juju's 27th, which I feel like is a good spot for him. But I might have
it's better than 34, which he is in Fantasy Pros.
And then MVS is 44. And if they're okay, we've done the Mecole thing like 3 years in a row. If there was ever a year to do it, it's probably this year, and no one's doing it. And I feel like
he just had the best season of his career last year, but it still wasn't that good. But it was the best season of his very short career.
But like, if you do a blind test of MVS and Mecole next to each other, they're basically the same player. Yeah. And the difference is that Mecole's more familiar with this offense.
The difference is we haven't seen MVS not live up to expectations in Kansas City like we have seen Mecole Hardman not live up to expectations in Kansas City. We kind of forget about it when it happens somewhere else, right?
Yeah, it's not like MVS came from playing with Daniel Jones. No, he played with the back-to-back reigning MVP and never had 1,000-yard seasons in a wide receiver room that's just as open as this one. I mean, Sky Moore at 48 also feels right. But Mecole at 57, like, I feel like it should go, in my opinion, Juju, Teardrop, Mecole, Sky Moore, MVS, and then like the rest of the guys, Justin Ross, Gordon, Justin Ross, and like, but this like discrepancy with Mecole really bothers me, and probably too much. But I was really happy when Kansas City signed MVS from like a role player perspective.
Yeah.
But the fantasy community has kind of gone overboard. And I feel like I know Kansas City well enough that I don't think that MVS is the answer in fantasy. I think Mecole has a better skill set, and I am going to pay for reception perception just to prove that MVS runs worse routes than Mecole. And if I'm wrong, we're going to start our own reception perception over here at the podcast.
I'm going to be a coward, and I'm not ready to like fully rank what I think the order of these guys is yet. And you're free to change your mind as things develop in camp. But I do want to see how things develop in camp before I fully plant my flag on an order. But I will, without a doubt, plant my flag on what we're seeing on Fantasy Pros, Juju in the 30s and all of these guys in the 50s. It will not happen. Either Juju will be awesome and all three of these guys will be like, you never know when to start them. Mecole have 2 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown one week and then nothing the next week. Or we're going to get Juju in the late 20s, early 30s, and then one of those guys, maybe two, like in the 40s, like late 30s, and they're going to be flex consideration on a weekly basis.
it's weird that the best quarterback in the NFL doesn't have a single player with the top 24 wide receiver ADP right now. Doesn't make a lot of sense.
I mean, Kelsey is the tight end one, so what's more strange, you say that, and then you look over at Green Bay, where there is literally not a pass catcher being drafted in the top 36 at receiver, and then I think Tunyon's 13 or 14 at tight end.
Now, why would fantasy players do that?
Why would they do that?
Okay, Dalton. I think we've hit home the AFC points here. We are going to be back with some training camp storylines next week. And I think the Raiders have already started their camp. We're going to have teams that have already started camp. So we'll have some fun things to discuss. Probably some breaking news, I would assume. Probably get some player props in there so I can catch up with you guys. You guys started last week. But thank you guys so much for listening to episode 74 of the Half Point Per Podcast. Going to do it for us today. Give us a follow on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at Half Point Per Pod. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Our top 12 video will be out at some point. I will not commit to a date. Please subscribe to the newsletter too, halfpointperpod.substack.com. Got about 3 team previews out per week. Each preview has 2 teams in it. So be on the lookout for those. Leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Listen to us on Spotify, and we will talk to everybody next week.